Okay, so Marian is a genetic genealogist who applies the science of DNA and genetic genealogy to solve the mystery of unknown parentage, provides names for deceased individuals, and to solve cold cases. She's an ardent advocate for law enforcement, and her interest in forensic investigations began at a young age, and her strong sense of justice led her to utilize her genetic genealogy skills to partner with law enforcement agencies to solve cold cases. Her website can be found at www.thegeneticdetective.com. So the floor is all yours. You got a couple of minutes before you have to start. So if you want to tell us some more about yourself or anything else, you're more than welcome to.
Okay. No, I just think that I've got so much to cover in my presentation, and I kind of wanted to kind of preface that up front. I apologize if I'm going to be going through it quickly. It's just 1 hour is kind of not enough time to fully explain what is all entailed when it comes to DNA and law enforcement. So I just want to state that up front. I'll be moving rather quickly, and if for some reason I run out of time to be able to answer questions, I'll be available when we do the group panel at the end to answer any questions that anyone may have. Hey, Andy, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, I couldn't hear you. So does it look like we're ready to go? I think it's just now 9. Are you ready?
You're ready.
Okay, great. Well, first of all, I just want to preface this by saying that I am a strong advocate for law enforcement, and also I'm an advocate for victims' rights. And so I want to state that up front in case you hear any biases in my presentation. So I just wanted to make that clear up front. But anyway, my presentation is entitled DNA and Law Enforcement. And it is about utilizing forensic genetic genealogy to solve cold cases. And there's another terminology that's used quite often as well, which is investigative genetic genealogy. And for this presentation, I choose to use forensic genetic genealogy because that is the legal term, forensic, in terms of when you're using an application that's used for law enforcement purposes or in the legal sense. So I will be referring to it as FGG, or forensic genetic genealogy. And also the Department of Justice has labeled it that as well. So you will hear me referring to it as that. So I'm going to give you a quick overview of my presentation. I'm going to be covering about 5 different topics, and I've broken them down this way. First of all, I'm going to cover the cold case crisis in America. And then I'm going to talk about the major differences between the law enforcement's DNA database, which is CODIS, and consumer or public DNA databases. And I get that question asked a lot, what is the difference? So I'll be trying to explain that to you. Number 3, I'm going to really talk about the challenges of using FGG for law enforcement. There are sometimes a lot of obstacles, and I sometimes get the question, if so many cold cases are being solved using forensic genetic genealogy, then why isn't every law enforcement agency in the country kind of scrambling to use it? And there are obstacles and challenges, so I'll talk about those. And then I will go through the process of FGG in investigations, kind of like a step-by-step procedure so everyone can understand that. And then finally, I want to celebrate the success of FGG in solving cold cases. So many of you see lots of faces. We know that there is a huge number of cold cases that have not been solved here in America, but we see the faces. We really don't know the numbers. So I want to give you some statistics kind of right up front so you'll know what we're dealing with. So in terms of homicides, the FBI puts forth a uniform crime report, and they provide estimates based on statistics. And what they show right now is that we currently have approximately 250,000 unsolved murders here in the U.S. And just let that number sink in for a minute. It's a huge number. Now, to compound this problem, about 6,000 unsolved cases are added each year. So this problem is not going away. It's actually getting worse with every year. And the reason for this is that only 62% of murders are solved each year for whatever reason, lack of evidence or whatever. So you can see how this is creating mounting caseloads for our investigators and law enforcement agencies. Now, there are approximately 18,000 law enforcement agencies in the US, but only about 7% of them have a dedicated cold case unit. So you can see why this number keeps mounting, because sometimes it's a lack of resources, and sometimes it's the fact that these cold cases have no new leads, and that's why, obviously, why they've gone cold. So what this means is that there are thousands of offenders who've never been apprehended. When you look at that first number of 250,000 unsolved murders, that means there's a certain percentage of those perpetrators who are still out among us, living among us. And what research indicates is that violent offenders are likely to repeat. So this creates a problem for us as law-abiding citizens, because these perpetrators are living among us. Now, but here's what they're doing. I just want to kind of go through this real quick. They are kind of flying under the radar. They're living a low visibility lifestyle. And the way they do this is they blend in with the community. They could be a coworker, a neighbor, or just an average person. And we've actually, who knows, we could have been rubbing elbows with someone, we would never know, because they have, they're able to adapt and blend in. Now, you hear the phrase about got away with murder, and so you start to wonder, for these cold cases, some of them are 25, 30, or 40 years old, is it really a smart criminal, or they've just been able to not be caught because of, we're still needing to advance in our technology to be able to track these criminals down. They are dangerous because new opportunities and triggers, could cause them to repeat or reoffend, which I just mentioned that they are likely to repeat their crime. Now, there's also a cold case crisis when it comes to unidentified decedents. Here in the United States, look at this number. We have approximately 40,000 at any given time of unidentified decedents. And this is really shocking as well, because we have the person and maybe we've got their DNA uploaded into a database, but there's been no positive ID of who they are. Now, these are commonly referred to as does, and you know that, the John Doe, Jane Doe, and those are called placeholder names, but a lot of times in the medical examiner's office, they'll add a number to that. So it could be Jane Doe or John Doe number 15. And that's why you'll see the phrase Doe a lot of times. Now, what we can do is we can get family reference samples, and these are DNA samples that are collected from relatives who are searching. And that's a big difference between some people who don't know that they could upload their DNA for some missing relative. And typically that requires samples from 2 or more close biological relatives. Now, if any of you are interested in these organizations or following up and doing more additional research, there's the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System. It's called NamUs.gov. The Center for Missing and Exploited Children, the FBI Unidentified Victims, and this it's called VCAP. It's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, I think is the acronym, what the acronym stands for. Then we've got the Doe Network. We've got Help ID Me on Facebook. And so if any of you are interested, you can just actually Google unidentified decedent, and you're going to pull up a page on Wikipedia, and there's some external links at the very bottom of the page. So anybody interested in trying to help out in this area, this is a good link for you. So what I'm going to talk about now is DNA in law enforcement and how they actually use DNA, how they've used it historically, traditionally, and now how they're using it today. So back in the mid-90s, the DNA Identification Act of 1994 was implemented, and it is basically legislation that authorized the FBI to establish the Combined DNA Index System, or CODIS. If you just see the word combined there, what it is, it's a 3-tier system. That means it's DNA from local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies. So it's combined into one large system, which we refer to as CODIS. And the legislation authorized the FBI to maintain this national database. That's what the NDIS is. And then just to briefly talk about the different indexes that are within CODIS. They've kind of got the profiles separated. So you've got convicted offenders, these people who, you know, we know who they are, they're convicted, there's a name on that DNA. And so that's the majority of the DNA profiles that are in CODIS right now. But we also have what's called forensic unknown, or just forensic profiles. And this may be DNA that was at a crime scene, and obviously in these whole case situations where DNA was collected, but the person's never been convicted before, their name is not in the system. So you got this unknown forensic sample sitting there, or unidentified, I should say. And then we've got unidentified human remains that have been uploaded. And then you've got the missing persons and relatives of missing persons, their DNA that's been uploaded, hoping to try to find that missing relative and to be connected to these unidentified human remains. So once again, the acronym CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System. And as I mentioned earlier, you got the 3 tiers, the 3 levels there. Currently, there are approximately 14 million offender profiles, which the database is a good size and obviously is going to continue to grow. And those are offenders. There are some approximately 4 million arrestee profiles in there. And then we've got about 1 million forensic profiles, which would fall into the category of the forensic unknowns and the unidentified decedents. Now, as of the end of 2020, there were approximately over 500,000 hits in CODIS. And let me just go on a little further to say this helped aid in approximately over 528,000 investigations. So clearly, CODIS is a huge success. It has its limitations, which I'm getting ready to talk about, but we have to applaud the programmers who designed this program way back in the 90s to be able to aid in all these investigations and solve these crimes. Now, one thing I'm going to point out right now, which I'm getting ready to get into when I talk about the differences between CODIS and our consumer databases, is that CODIS uses what's called STR DNA analysis. So we'll be talking about an STR profile. Anytime you hear STR, that is the Criminal Justice System database here, CODIS. Okay, so what is STR? STR stands for short tandem repeat. We're going to be using a lot of acronyms here. It makes things easier. So it's an STR DNA analysis, and basically what that is, STRs are short fragments of DNA where a letter sequence is repeated. And those of you who've taken a biology class, you probably understand that. And what STR forensic analysis does, it amplifies only 20 core loci, which are, look, these 20 core loci are common sets that STR analysis is trying to identify. And what this does when they test these particular sets, well, first of all, I just want to mention that these markers are highly variable among people, among individuals, due to the number of repeats. That's a little bit different than the next testing I'm going to talk about, which is SNP testing. So the good thing about STR profiles is they are very effective for one-to-one human comparison and identification. So just remember, STR is very effective at one-to-one matching. And also with STR, degraded and low amounts of DNA can successfully be typed. So the thing to remember is that CODIS uses STR analysis to generate a DNA profile. So here's the difference between why law enforcement is now being assisted with these consumer databases. The difference is the type of testing. And so SNP testing, it's another acronym here, but it stands for single nucleotide polymorphisms. And we just refer to it as SNP. And what this is, SNPs are single small changes in your DNA code, which is rare. And after they change, they seldom change back. They don't back mutate. And STRs, sometimes they do back mutate. So it's just a different type of testing. And with SNP testing, they test approximately 730,000 or over 730,000 DNA markers. And what this means is that, first of all, these markers are more stable and they're more precise because, once again, they seldom, back mutate. But this provides vastly more information than STR profiles. And the reason, and I'll explain why that's important to us as genetic genealogists, that allows us to determine genetic relatedness at a far greater distance back in time. So those STR profiles that CODIS is using, it's just looking at, is this person a match? No, they're not. But when we, as consumers and genetic genealogists, use the consumer databases and SNP testing, we're able to see who's related, 3, 4, 10 generations back. And so this gives us an increased ability to identify a most recent common ancestor. And obviously, what we're using this for is to try to determine whose DNA this is, and we can't do that without finding out who the relatives are. So basically, just remember that consumer databases use SNP analysis to get a profile, and CODIS uses STR, which is a major difference. So just to do a comparison side by side, CODIS database is a one-to-one comparison. It confirms an exact match. If there's not a match, there's no other leads. So this is where law enforcement comes to a standstill in an investigation. They've got the DNA, it's been uploaded to CODIS, and there's no match. And it doesn't give them any further leads, okay, unlike the consumer databases do. And so now it can possibly show that I've read some articles where there's been a father and a son, and CODIS will possibly see, hey, this person, has a relative, but it's a very, very close relationship, typically father and son. So the other thing with the CODIS database, it's only comparing to offenders, only. And so if that offender, maybe they're even a serial killer, but they've never been caught, and their name is not in that database attached to any forensic sample, then they just have a DNA and they don't know who the person is. So it's only compared to people who have been caught in the past. And at this time, familial searching is not permitted within the CODIS database. That's a totally different topic, but who knows, maybe in the future that possibly could change. So therefore, STR analysis cannot identify distant relatives. And that's why these cold cases go cold when they have DNA evidence. It's either a match or it's not. Okay, unlike this consumer databases, as genetic genealogists, we can identify close and distant relatives based on someone's DNA. And I can have an adoptee upload their DNA, and not knowing their mother, their father, any of their heritage, their line of heritage, and I can start, you know, as those of you who do unknown parentage cases know, you can start identifying close and distant relatives immediately. And the way we do this, which I'm going to get into a little bit for those of you who are new to genetic genealogy, is we use centimorgans to determine genetic relatedness. I'll explain that further, as I said. We're also able to distinguish ancestral heritage. And this gives us the ability to build out a family tree, unlike the CODIS database system. And what this does, it allows us to narrow down a list of suspects. So I could start out with a huge family tree and there's 200 or 300 people on it. And as you're narrowing down to who the parents of this perpetrator could be, you're narrowing it down. It's kind of going down like a funnel down to one set of parents, like where the family lines intersect, where the maternal line and the paternal line of the suspect came together in order to give this suspect their DNA that we're analyzing. And I think most of you know that the public voluntarily opts into law enforcement when we're talking about consumer databases. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about challenges for law enforcement agencies. So sometimes law enforcement agencies are unaware of forensic genetic genealogy. Now, it's been in the news a lot lately, and there are many agencies who are, you know, trying to scramble to see what they can do to solve their backlog of cold cases. But there are still a lot of agencies that are unaware. So that's one thing, is just not knowing about it. Also, forensic genetic genealogy originated as a citizen science. It did not come from the FBI. So therefore, this new forensic tool was developed outside of law enforcement. And typically law enforcement only uses things that, you know, have developed from within, say, the FBI, and that they've been working on. So this kind of came out of nowhere, really. And some of them that I've talked to, there's some law enforcement professionals are still a little skeptical about how it works. They don't fully understand it. And that's, you know, we can all understand how they don't understand that, because it does get complicated unless you work with it every day. There are sometimes obstacles to getting approval from a DA's office to use forensic genetic genealogy. But that's better now with the policy from the Department of Justice that's been issued, which I'm going to briefly touch on. Then another challenge is access to the original evidence or process samples. And so if an investigator wants to use genetic genealogy, but they cannot get the original evidence or the processed samples from a crime lab, or if those samples have not been maintained properly, then this whole thing comes to a screeching halt. They cannot move forward with forensic genetic genealogy. So everything is dependent upon the DNA. It all goes back to the DNA. Do you have it, and what is the quantity of that sample? So also there's limited resources in terms of manpower, womanpower within department agencies, and budget constraints, because this does cost money. And I want to talk about that real quick in just a couple more slides about the cost. And the reality is that new homicides tend to take priority over cold cases, because, you know that they are working with fresh evidence, or working with a fresh crime scene and witnesses, possible witnesses. And so the quicker they can solve new cases, they won't become a cold case. So sometimes the cold cases do they kind of remain on the back burner, because they're having to work new homicide cases all the time. So I want to just briefly show you this shot here of what this is the DOJ, which is the Department of Justice, issued an interim policy on FGG. This was back in November of 19, so it's been out a little over a year. And basically what it is, it's some guidelines to follow if you're going to try to use forensic genetic genealogy to solve a cold case. And it's very good. I just want to say it's only 8 pages long. I think it's very straightforward. It's easy to read and understand. And you can go to the justice.gov website, and this OLP stands for the Office of Legal Policies, and then look for forensic science. But if you just scroll down that page, look for recent publications, you can download this whole policy. And this is what investigators have to kind of follow. And it also gives all the information to the district attorney's offices in terms of how the case should be handled, how this investigation and how the whole process should be handled. So one thing, I'm going to just talk about a few key points. This policy applies to agencies that receive funding from the DOJ or funding specifically for FGG. Okay, if you're a small agency and you don't receive funding, then you may not have to necessarily follow all these steps, but I just want to show these steps are easy to follow and they're good to follow. And it's going to probably, rather than an interim policy, it's going to become the actual policy over time as it gets updated. So basically, in order to use FGG, it has to be on an unsolved violent crime case, which either homicide or sexual offenses. It can also be used on unidentified remains of a suspected homicide victim, and also on possibly criminal acts that present a substantial threat to public safety. So you kind of have to fall in one of these categories. And so if you want to look at this as a checklist as we go through, you can just say, check, we've got a cold case here. Okay, number 2, is there a match in CODIS? No, otherwise you wouldn't be pursuing this avenue. So check, there's no match in CODIS or the NamUs or VCAP database. Have you exhausted all other leads? Okay, and you would have to probably say yes to that because, you know, if the case is 25, 30 years old, you've probably exhausted all other leads and you're looking at this almost as your last hope to solve this case. This just kind of outlines the procedural steps in terms of contacting the crime lab to see if the sample can be retested. It enforces the concept that this has to be a collaborative approach. Investigators are going to be working with the lab professionals and prosecutors. It's kind of like, you know, one person can't kind of go off and do their own thing. They're wanting it to be a collaborative approach to be successful to reach a conviction. So therefore, it needs to be approved by a prosecutor. And I just want to point out here that for anybody who's wondering that, okay, no arrest can be made based solely on an FGG lead. And I think that's some misconception that people have out there is that, oh no, if you're identified in one of these databases, you could likely be arrested. No, you're just identified as a lead. You're a potential suspect, but they can't arrest you based on that. And I'll tell you why. What they're going to have to do, investigators will have to make collection of secondary DNA samples for STR analysis. And that's either done, you know, surreptitiously or covertly. But what they're going to have to do is, once the lead is given to an investigator, they have to get a sample from that person. Like, is this person our perpetrator? And so once they have to take that sample and get it tested through their own crime lab, through STR analysis, and compare it to the original crime scene evidence. Okay, so I just want to make that very clear, that that's the process. And then this policy just says you must document each step, the cost of it, and what the outcome is. So basically, you can see they put a policy in place, but it's easy to be followed, I believe. Okay, so let's talk about crime scenes. Once you're getting your source, where you're getting your source of evidence, your DNA evidence. So when it comes to perpetrator, we know if they leave blood, semen, saliva, mucus, hair, skin cells, or perspiration. All of these can produce a DNA profile. And skin cells is now kind of commonly referred to as touch DNA. And so just say, for instance, if the perpetrator was using a ligature around, strangling someone, maybe there's not blood or semen or whatever, but the skin cells from his hands could leave touch DNA on that piece of evidence, and he could be identified through that. Now, when it comes to getting DNA from an unidentified remains, that's more difficult because, a lot of times these bodies are not recovered for many years. They may be found in a shallow grave, and the decomposition has already taken place. So one thing depends on how long they've been there. The tissue, degrades very rapidly, but that, if it's more recent, if it's been recent, that's something they could use. Hair, of course, and also a tooth. There's what's called tooth pulp inside of your tooth that's still able to have DNA extracted, and then also just from bone, and that takes it's a little bit more difficult process than these others over here. So what it all comes down to, you cannot proceed on a case unless you have sufficient a decent amount of quality DNA and quantity. And so what hopefully we're looking for is a single source DNA, which comes from just one person. And then the mixed source would come obviously from two people, the perpetrator and maybe the victim, but that can be separated and analyzed. It's just a little bit more costly to do that, but it can be analyzed and produce a profile. And then a degraded sample, which the newer technology is advancing every day to where what was impossible just a few years ago is now possible. In terms of quantity, they're usually looking for a minimum of 1 nanogram. Sometimes some places require 10 nanograms for semen or 100 nanograms for bone. But I know there's one lab out of Houston that's been successful extracting DNA with extremely small amounts from bone. And so these numbers are going to be outdated, very quickly because of advances in technology. And all of these requirements and extraction fees, they vary by lab. So if you're trying to get testing done at one lab and they can't do it, then an investigator needs to get on the phone and start contacting another lab. Or if they're working with a FGG vendor, that person, your case manager, would be doing that for you. So here's just a brief snapshot of what a form would look like. And so they're looking for the nanograms here. This is what a crime lab technician needs to fill out for an investigator to determine, do you even have enough DNA to have it retested? Okay, so they're going to be looking for the nanograms, the volume and the concentration. They're going to ask about a degradation index. How degraded is the DNA? If it's a single or mixed source. And down here at this last question, are we able to consume the entire sample for testing? And that's what crime labs investigators have to be careful of. If they're left with only a small amount of DNA, you've got to make that decision if you're going to move forward. But that may be your only way to solve this case, is to take that risk and consume the entire sample. So let's talk about the consumer databases. Most of you know that GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA are the only two that work with law enforcement. With GEDmatch, you have to opt in. With Family Tree DNA, you opt out. And the other two big players here, Ancestry and 23andMe, do not work with law enforcement. And, neither does MyHeritage or all of the others. So these are the two major databases that all these forensic genetic genealogists are using to try to solve these crimes. So now I'm going to talk about the process. So basically, we're starting with GEDmatch, we're starting with Family Tree DNA, and we're building this tree. And, as you see here, you're starting out with a huge tree, and as I said, you're funneling it down to 1 or 2 or 3 individuals, hopefully. So what are the initial steps? What does an investigator have to do to get this process started? Typically, it's the investigator or a family member that initiates the request for FGG. What I've had happen to me is that typically it's a family member who's heard about it or watched a TV program, and they're wondering if it can work for their loved one's cold case. And then a lot of times it's investigators who've been hearing about it, or maybe they've been to a conference and heard about it. So somebody has to take the lead to kind of initiate the process and then take responsibility to keep pushing it forward. And I do want to say that this can be a very long process. So, you know, the victim's family members need to realize it's not going to happen overnight. But once it gets in the hands of a FGG, of a genealogist, it can be solved rather quickly. So they have to locate the evidence report from a file or obtain it from the crime lab. Once again, we're looking to see what evidence you have. That lab technician is going to indicate the quantity and quality. And then if you have sufficient quality and quantity, then the investigator typically presents it to the DA office to get approval to proceed. At that point, you're probably looking at choosing your FGG vendor or a case manager to start submitting these forms and get the case going. And once that form goes over to whichever testing lab you're going to choose, they will approve the sample for submission, that you've got sufficient quality and quantity, or they're going to tell you it's too risky and you might lose this sample if they consume it. Then at that point, you can kind of confirm the cost to obtain department approval to proceed. And the reason why is if you have a core sample or it's degraded, it's going to cost you a lot more. So as I mentioned, a lot of budgets are constrained and you have to come up with a cost, which is what I'm going to talk about in just a minute. Okay, so everybody wants to know, what are the costs of using forensic genetic genealogy? Well, first of all, SNP testing, and I'm just using a sample here from Gene by Gene lab. If it's a single source, you're looking at probably $750. If it's a mixed source or degraded source, it could be up to $1,500. So the price could double depending on the quality and the quantity that you have. The actual research time, FGG vendors are typically quoting an average between $3,500 and $4,000, and that's about for 15 hours of research, although I think Family Tree DNA is offering some pro bono and maybe capping it at $4,000. But I just want to let you know that those of you who work on unknown parentage cases, you know that it can go well beyond 15 hours. And so there could be additional costs there, but we're just talking about a ballpark right now and trying to get a rough estimate. So when it's uploaded to GEDmatch, that's free. If you upload it to Family Tree DNA, it's free if you're using their lab as the SNP testing company. They will automatically upload it for you. So this comes out to, you're looking at starting off 5,000 plus, and you know, if everything went well, you know, you could just end up looking at that number rather than a higher number. But we know that things don't always work as easily as we would like them to. So I just want to mention some funding sources. There are grants for FGG. And so if there's any law enforcement professionals watching, you're wondering, I would love to do this, but we can't pay for it. Well, the Department of Justice has a website, and if you click on Office of Justice Programs and then Bureau of Justice Assistance, there are some specific grants that can cover FGG. But with any grant, you know that there's a lot of research that needs to be done, there's paperwork that needs to be prepared, and then there are deadlines. And I think their grants open and close only once a year, and you've only got a couple months to get your request in, and that may be coming up here in the spring, the deadline. I haven't seen the deadline yet for this next round of funding. And then there are private organizations who are willing to donate money to pay for FGG. And then also I've had a family member that has told me that they are willing to pay for the testing and the genealogical services just to get the case closed. So there are other options if your budget does not have any funds available to use it. And I just want to make a note down here that it provides potential to solve more cases with less time and less money, because, you know, just think of some investigators have been working on these cold cases for 20 years or whatever. If this case can be solved within 2 months, just think of the time and the money you're saving by using FGG. So let's talk about some of the service providers. We got some of the big names here. We've got Gene by Gene, which is obviously owned by Family Tree DNA. We've got Parabon Labs, which is in the news for their large amount of cases that they've been solving. We got a smaller company here that is now working on cases called Othram. That's a Houston-based. I think Gene by Gene is Houston-based. Othram is based in the Woodlands. Parabon's up in Virginia, and Bodie Technology, I think, is up in Virginia as well. So, and there are many others. I just want to say these are some of the ones that are more well-known, and they've been in the news lately. And a few law enforcement agencies now have their own in-house programs, so we're starting to see that more and more. And there are private contractors, you know, which are individual genetic genealogists that are partnering with law enforcement to help solve these cold cases. So I want to talk about genetic relatedness. The question that always comes up, especially from law enforcement, is how do you know who this person's related to when you upload it? And so for those beginners, you kept hearing the word centimorgans. I want to explain it just for you quickly, because those of us who've used it for years, we kind of gloss over that and we expect everybody to know what it is. So basically what a centimorgan is, it's a unit of genetic measurement of DNA. So think of it in terms of ounces, inches. Those are measurements, and the more you add to it, the more you have. The more centimorgans you share with someone, the closer the relationship, the closer a match you are. So I'm just going to show you some examples real quick of centimorgans. You just got to think of it in terms of numbers, okay? So a parent-child relationship, say that it's an average of 3,400. Now, there are ranges, but let's just say an average. So you get this stuck in your mind, hey, 3,400 centimorgans, that must be the son or the daughter of this person. Sibling relationships around average 2,600, half sibling 1,760, but and their ranges could be as low as 1,100 on up to 1,900 or something. But look at this aunt uncle relationship around 1,740 for an average, niece nephew 1,740. If you look at these last three, these 1,760, 40, 40, these are so close. These overlap, and you have to look at ages. Then and so these are always a possibility that you're going to have overlapping, and that's when all of your traditional genealogical work comes into play to try to determine how is this person related when the centimorgans are not going to tell you anymore. And then first cousins, an average 860. So for those of you or law enforcement who are wondering how we determine how someone's related, this is the starting point right here. How much DNA do they share with another person? And this is the unit of measure that we talk about, centimorgans. So I'm just going to throw this chart up here real quickly. This is a chart that gives all those ranges we were talking about. You can look in each one of these blocks and you can see an average for an aunt and uncle is 1,741, and then you can see a range. And that's 1,201 to 2,282. You can see there's quite a range there, but then you're going to see overlap between all these other relationships. So what this chart does, it just kind of fans out above and below and out to the left and to the right to where you can see how a person may be related based on their centimorgans. And so I just always wanted to encourage everyone, if you're a beginner, this is the thing that you need to start with if you're just now getting into genetic genealogy. In order to kind of wrap your head around these numbers, you can go to, and I couldn't put it up here on the screen, but it's called DNApainter.com. And then there's a little tab that says tools, and you click on that. You can download this, this chart here. Now, this was created by Blaine Bettinger, and it was just updated last March. And it's just invaluable. You can't really do genetic genealogy without understanding centimorgans. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get into the process. Here's what actually happens when investigators have gotten the SNP profile, gotten approval, the SNP testing has been done, and a profile has been created, and it has now been uploaded to GEDmatch and the FTDNA database. And this is typically where the genealogist comes in, okay? Actually, gene by gene, as I mentioned earlier, will upload the profile for you. But if you're getting it done through another test lab, you get the profile back as a genealogist, and you are updating these, you're uploading the profiles into these databases. And your very first action is to research the closest matches. You're hoping for extremely close matches because you know your time is going to be cut in half if you do get some close matches. So you analyze and evaluate those centimorgans, as I just described, to determine what the possible relationship of this suspect is to all of those other people that he's related to. He or she is related to. Then once you start determining who they're related to, you can start cross-referencing public family trees, and just within GEDmatch, obviously, and FTDNA. But then once you start getting a surname and you see a particular family lineage, you can go to other databases that are considered public, and you start filling out that family tree. Here's all your traditional research that's going to step in. This is the stuff that takes you hours and hours to do. You may be searching census records, trying to find out and account for every child that was born to a particular parent. The vital records, obituaries, newspaper articles. It's just the same way. Those of you who are watching, you know, who do unknown work on unknown parentage cases, it's the same exact method that genealogists are using to solve these cold cases, because you're working with unknown DNA and you're trying to find out who they're related to, and you're doing the same research as you would for an adoptee case or unknown parentage case. And what we're all looking for is that most recent common ancestor, whether that's a great-grandparent or it could be a third great-grandparent, and that's where we're going to start our tree, and we're going to build downward to the perpetrator or the suspect that we've identified. You know, this takes a lot of work as well. Those of you who know that, to build out a family tree. And what you're looking for is that point of convergence where two family lines intersect. So you're seeing this person has DNA from this one family line, and it keeps popping up, and you know that family line. And then once you determine this other family line, there's either going to be a marriage, or if there was not a marriage, the two people obviously had a child together who then gave their DNA to this perpetrator. And that's how you're going to determine who this perpetrator is, by finding out, hopefully, who the perpetrator's parents are. During this process, you're going to eliminate possible suspects based on age, gender, and geography. That's kind of quite easy to do if, you know, certain people are under the age of maybe committing a particular crime, or somebody possibly could be too old, or if they've already deceased, they're eliminated immediately if they were deceased at the time the crime occurred. And what you're looking to do is, once you narrow down and eliminate all the possible suspects, you're going to provide a name or the names of the potential suspects to law enforcement. And what happens here is, if there, say for instance, there were 2 daughters and 3 sons born to a particular set of parents, and if it was a sexual assault, we know it's a male, then you may be able to give law enforcement, you may only be able to give them 3 names. You can't ID the perpetrator because those 3 sons are carrying the DNA of those 2 parents. So a lot of times you can't specifically identify the perpetrator. And I just want to point out that this is just a lead that's provided to investigators. You know, you have not solved the case at this point. This is just a lead, and they have to do the traditional investigative work in order to follow up on this lead. Just like someone phoned in a tip and they get a name. Well, what did they do with the name? They have to follow up on that lead. So basically, you've taken a family tree. You may have had grandparents and aunts and uncles and cousins and brothers and sisters. You've narrowed it down to hopefully 1 person before you're turning that information over to law enforcement. So, investigating the lead. Once that lead is provided to the investigator, he or she then runs a search for all the prior arrests and convictions and tries to find out who this person is and where they've lived, even their whole driver's license history, addresses that have, you know, their residences during the time that the crime occurred. And then they may then go into conducting surveillance to obtain that DNA sample from the suspect. Okay, so remember, this is a very important step. Once they get that DNA sample from the suspect, it has to be retested through STR analysis and then uploaded to CODIS. Okay, so once it's uploaded to CODIS, it's going to be compared to the perpetrator's DNA left at the crime scene. So way back 30 years ago, it's compared 1-to-1. Remember, STR analysis is excellent in comparing 1-to-1. And so if there is a positive match, 100% positive match, then an arrest warrant can be issued based on probable cause. So like I said earlier, no one's going to get arrested just because a genealogist gave a lead to an investigator, to law enforcement. It has to be an exact match in CODIS to the original crime scene, and that is all law enforcement's lab that's doing that. That's not the consumer databases that's going to make that positive ID. So, and also a conviction. People have been talking about, oh, forensic genetic genealogy may not hold up in court. Well, we are just providing the leads. We're not solving case. It's the investigators who get that other DNA profile and get it uploaded, and then a match is made. So its conviction will be based on a STR profile match, not a SNP profile match. So now I want to talk about the success of forensic genealogy. This is the happy part, the good part about all of this, where we get to talk about all these cold cases that have been solved. So the first case, most of you've probably heard. If you haven't heard about all the others, you've probably heard about this one, which is why I'm bringing up. The very first case solved using forensic genetic genealogy was the AKA Golden State Killer. And I'll briefly touch on him in just a minute, just kind of give you some stats. As of this date, there are over 200 cold cases that have been solved using FGG. And this is just since April of 2018. So think about that, 200 cold cases. And some of these cold cases are for unidentified remains. So this is not all homicide cases. But I think Parabon Labs is reporting they've solved about 155 cases. And I think most all of theirs are homicides. So you can see there's this probably many more than this number right here. And just think back where the first screen I showed you, and there were thousands of people, and we know there are 2,000 unsolved murders, over 250,000 unsolved murders. Well, we're making a dent here, but obviously there is a lot more work to be done. There are a lot more genealogists that need to be working on cold cases to try to get that number down from 250,000 to get it down to as low as possible. So we've got, as I mentioned, private companies offering FGG services. We've got individual genetic genealogists offering their services. And we have the state and local agencies, as I mentioned, developing in-house programs. And I just want to make this point very clear that some cold cases can only be solved with FGG. And the reason for that is if it's 25, 30 years old and there are no new leads, you've exhausted all of those leads, and all you have is DNA evidence, okay, then that case could be solved with FGG. If it's never tested, if FGG is never used, it may never be solved. So I just wanted to make that distinction here that some cases can only be solved using FGG. So now I want to talk about the pioneers of FGG. First of all, I want to talk about Barbara Rae-Venter. Many of you probably know the name, but for those of you who don't, she is the person, well, currently right now, she's the director of investigative genetic genealogy at Gene by Gene. That's the Family Tree DNA's lab based out of Houston. And she is the one who identified the Golden State Killer. I just think we need to give her a lot of credit, a ton of credit for starting this whole thing, as well as everyone knows CeCe Moore. And I say everyone just because she has been on lots of television programs and she's very well known in this field. And she's the chief genetic genealogist at Parabon Labs, Nano Labs. And she leads a team right now of genetic genealogists who work around the clock, and that's why they've been able to solve so many cold cases. But we owe just a ton of credit and praise to these two individuals because it took a lot of courage. I think when Barbara had solved the case of the Golden State Killer, at first she remained anonymous, you know, because it takes a lot of courage to come out and say that you ID'd a serial killer, you know. There's some concerns about that. And same way with CeCe Moore. I think she has talked in the past that she was a little hesitant at first, not knowing what the public's response would be for using, you know, trying to identify relatives of a perpetrator. So both of these women get a lot of credit and praise for being so courageous and being able to do this work, stand up and do this work. And actually, they've been blazing a trail for the rest of us genealogists to follow in their pathway. So just wanted to mention them real quickly. And here's just a screenshot. When we're talking about faces of all these unsolved cases, hopefully a lot more can have the word above them solved, just for the victim's family, if for no one else. Okay, so here's the Golden State Killer. His name, which, you know, unfortunately he gets he's become infamous, but his name is Joseph James D'Angelo Jr. And so a lot of you have seen his mugshot. I'm just going to give you a few of his stats, but I also refer to him as the poster child for genetic genealogy, because this is the one, and maybe rightly so, he was notorious for eluding law enforcement. And finally, a technology came out where he cannot elude law enforcement any longer. So he is also known, as I mentioned, as the Golden State Killer. As of right now, we know he's committed 13 murders. He could have committed more. He could have changed his MO. We don't know. But right now, he's been convicted of 13. And 50 rapes he's been convicted of, over 120 burglaries. His active years were 73 through 86. And so I say that he could have changed his MO, just thinking that this murder number could be higher. He could have, rather than left the bodies at the scene of the crime, he could have started burying them. He could have started dumping in rivers and there was no evidence left, or he could have started using condoms. You know, we don't know if this number could be higher, but thank God he's off the streets now. One point to make note of, he eluded capture for 45 years. So when I was talking earlier about them living among us, he was living among us in a neighborhood. He was a co-worker. He's out mowing his lawn. You know, he's at Home Depot, rubbing elbows with everyone around him, and no one would have had any idea that he had done all of these crimes. He was apprehended in 2018, and at his age at capture was 72 years old. He's been sentenced to 12 life sentences plus 8 years. So I wanted to stop right now. For those of you who were hoping to see some case studies, I didn't have time for that, but I want to give you an important link if you really would like to read up on the cases that have been solved, and also for investigators who are going to make a case or try to go to your chief and say, I want to use this new technology. Here's some good information for you. There's a website called the International Society of Genetic Genealogy, and here's the website there. And there's a Wikipedia page there that you can click on that has a lengthy list of cold cases solved by forensic genetic genealogy. And I think right now I counted like 53 homicide cases, and there are all the links to the articles. So you can see the news articles, you can see which agency was involved, and you can actually print out all these articles. And for those of you junkies who want to research cold cases, if you're doing a project or whatever, this is an invaluable resource right here. It has at least these 53 homicide cases, and it kind of goes into all the details about how they were solved. And so basically, if you go to this website, just go make sure on the wiki page, and then in the search bar, click law enforcement, and all these articles will pull up. Okay, so I'm going to have to move along. I think I'm running out of time here. Just wanted to make a suggestion for law enforcement agencies, what you can do to tackle this backlog of cold cases. First and foremost is try to allocate some funds. When you're preparing your annual budgets, go ahead and put money in there, and then see how you're going to use that money later. You can apply for grant funding, and if you're kind of wondering which ones do I use, you can review all your cases and try to prioritize the top 5, and maybe it's based on the ones you know you have good solid DNA evidence, and then try to move forward with the top 5 cases, because if they upload those and 3 of them they're not getting too many hits, then maybe you're only going to be able to solve 2 of the cases. So that's why I'm saying maybe prioritize your top 5. You're going to then establish a relationship with an FGG vendor or a genetic genealogist who's going to partner with you. Or maybe eventually law enforcement agencies, what I'm hoping, will look at hiring a genetic genealogist to work in-house, like when a detective leaves and then you've got and vacancy, rather than hiring another detective. If you've got a huge backlog of cases, this person can sit there and do nothing but work on cold cases. And obviously this can prevent crimes from occurring in the future. Okay, let me see. I'm gonna skip over the page of controversy. Don't have time for that. And my blood might start boiling. Okay, so my final plea to everyone, those of you who have ever wondered what can you do to help solve cold cases and bring justice to families, here's what you can do. You can upload your raw data file to GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA because it's free. And you can opt in to law enforcement. You'll see this little icon there with police, and you make sure that there's not a red line drawn through it. You opt in so they can utilize your DNA to help solve cold cases. Many of you maybe have already tested with GEDmatch or Family Tree DNA, and you have not opted in. Either you forgot or you're lazy, whatever it is. Make sure after today you make yourself a note, you go in and opt in. And also encourage all your family and friends to do so. And if you need to help them figure out how to do it, if they're willing, please do that for them. And I just want to say that, you know, victims' families are waiting for justice, and we may be that missing link. My DNA, your DNA may be that missing link that's going to help law enforcement solve the case, which is good for investigators who carry around a heavy burden, for years hoping to solve these cases, and it's a lot of stress on them, and then for the families who've been dying for an answer. It may not bring closure, but at least it'll give them some answers of who did this and then bring that person to justice. So at that point, I'll go ahead and let's see, finish out my presentation, and I'll turn it back over to Andy.